Okay, so welcome everyone to another session of the Leuven. And before I start introducing the speakers, I would like to ask you to switch on your cameras so that we can see each other. And I would also like to tell you that after the formal part of the seminar, we will stay online for an informal chat. So if you don't have the time to ask the question you would like to ask, you can ask it in the informal part after the formal one. So I am very pleased today to welcome Professor Owen Ware, who is associate professor at the University of Toronto. He has previously held tenure track and postdoctoral positions in the US, in Canada, and in Germany. And his areas of focus include Kant, German idealism, and Romanticism, and also South Asian philosophies. His current projects are on topics such as the metaphysics of freedom, theories of mythology, and the European reception of classical Indian thought. He has published more than 30 papers in journals such as Mind, Journal of the History of Philosophy, American Philosophical Quarterly, and the European Journal of Philosophy. And among his publications, I would like to highlight two monographs that are particularly relevant to our discussion today because they are on Kant's practical philosophy. So in 2021, he published Kant's Justification of Ethics by Oxford University Press. And there is another forthcoming monograph on Kant on freedom that will be published by Cambridge University Press. So Owen Ware will give a talk today on Kant's causality of freedom. And as a respondent to his paper, it is also my pleasure to introduce Paul Guyer. Paul Guyer is a professor at Brown University, and he's an international leading Kant scholar, and his interests include all areas of Kant's philosophy and also the history of aesthetics. He's the author of several monographs, such as Kant and the Claims of Taste, published by Harvard University Press, Kant and the Claims of Knowledge, published by Cambridge University Press, and Knowledge, Reason, and Taste, Kant's Response to Hume, published by Princeton University Press. He's general co-editor of the Cambridge edition of Kant's works, in which he has co-translated the Critique of Pure Reason, the Critique of the Power of Judgment, and Kant's Notes and Fragments. So I think we'll have a wonderful discussion today. I'm really looking forward to it. And I would just like to present the structure of our discussion. So Owen Ware will present his pre-circulated paper that Pavel will post on the chat. And he will present this paper in about 10 minutes. Paul Guyer will then respond to the paper also in 10 minutes. And Owen Ware will have then the opportunity to respond to the response in 5 minutes, and then we will have a general discussion with the audience. So it is a great pleasure to give you the floor now, Owen Ware, to present your paper on Kant and the causality of freedom. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks for that introduction, and I want to thank Karen for inviting me to give this talk. And also a big thanks to Paul for being the respondent for today and everybody who showed up today. So I thought that it could be useful for me to just use these 10 minutes or so to give you a breakdown of what I took to be the problems motivating this paper. And to give you a little bit of a background of how I got into it, I mean, I feel like I've been working on this topic for a very long time, but it was kind of, for me, a periphery topic, Kant's theory of freedom, specifically in his mature period as it evolved from the first critique through to the groundwork, the religion, and beyond. But I never really tried to grapple with it head on. And I think maybe this is something people can relate to here. I probably was guilty of thinking I had a handle on Kant's theory of freedom. Like I kind of knew the basics. And so that would allow me to get on to doing work on other topics that interested me at the time. And the more I kind of turned my focus directly on Kant's theory of freedom, the more I became aware of all these riddles and puzzles and tensions and apparent contradictions that I came to the conclusion are not resolved even today after over 200 years. And one of my entry points into this particular paper that I shared with you came from this passage in the Metaphysics of Morals, where Kant says, rather strikingly, that freedom of choice cannot be defined, as some have tried to define it, in terms of an ability to choose for or against the law. And this struck me for two reasons. The first is that I didn't feel that this passage, as important as it is, as a kind of a bold declaration of Kant's view of freedom, had received the kind of attention from scholars that I thought that it deserved. So that kind of flagged me to something important. But then there was the obvious problem that isn't the ability to choose for or against the law precisely the concept of freedom that's operative in Kant's religion, or at least so it seems on the surface. So then you have this question, is Kant now changing his mind in the Metaphysics of Morals? Is he being inconsistent? Is he contradicting himself? So that was one of my entry points. And a second entry point came in the process of actually finalizing my book, Fichte's Moral Philosophy, which drew me a lot into trying to get a handle of Kant's early critics, including the young Fichte. And I became aware of this preoccupation of thinkers over Kant's theory of freedom. And even though it hadn't been really given a name, I thought that it deserves the name of the freedom controversy, or what I call the Freiheitsstreit. And basically, what I do in this paper is try to use the context of the freedom controversy as a way to get into these systematic puzzles surrounding Kant's theory of freedom. So this leads me to the question, well, what are these puzzles? If you look at the timeline of events, you see something like this. You have Kant define freedom in the first critique as an absolute causal spontaneity beginning from itself. This leaves open the question of what is the principle or norm or law governing the faculty of freedom. And the answer we get in the groundwork, section 3, is that it's the moral law. So it seems as though by 1785, Kant is unequivocally committed to the thesis that the moral law is the causal law of a free will. And I call this Kant's moral necessitarianism. And in 1788, Professor Ulrich published this text called Eleutherology. And this is the text, I believe, that sort of initiated the Freiheitsstreit, set the freedom controversy in motion. And what's relevant for us today is this particular objection that Ulrich raises against Kant's theory of freedom that I call the objection from necessity. And it's pretty simple. The idea is that while Kant may have been successful in saving freedom of will from determinism at the phenomenal level, what he's done in making the moral law the causal law of a free will is just reintroduce a problem of determinism at the noumenal level. And so the will seems to be subject to a strict kind of determinism, moral determinism, or what his pupil Schmid would later call intelligible fatalism or intelligible determinism. And so the idea is that Kant has not actually rescued freedom, he's just reintroduced a new form of determinism at a higher level. And now the plot thickens because it seems as though Kant was aware of these problems and he tried to modify or alter or revise his definition of freedom in the essay on the radical evil of human nature that became part 1 of The Religion. Because it's in this text, The Religion, that we get this definition of freedom as the ability to choose a character or a disposition that either gives the moral law priority or self-love priority. So that seems to now take us away from a kind of moral necessitarian position into a kind of moral libertarian position in which freedom is defined as a leeway power or an indifferent power to choose between the moral law or self-love. Now, at this point, Leonard Kreutzer, in 1793, published his book, Skeptical Observations on Freedom of the Will. And this is sort of the next major moment in the timeline of the Freiheitsstreit that I try to unravel in this paper. Because Kreutzer basically raised a new objection to Kant, which was that by defining the will in terms of an indifferent capacity to choose either for or against the law, there's now this objection that it reduces the activity of the will to mere chance. And so when you put these two problems together, this is what I'm suggesting is sort of like the dilemma that structures the Freiheitsstreit at the time. One horn of the dilemma says, from Ulrich, that if the moral law is the causal law of a free will, then we reduce the activity of the will to a kind of noumenal determinism. On the other hand, according to Kreutzer, if we redefine the will in terms of a leeway power to choose for or against the law, we then reduce the activity of the will to mere chance, which is to say, there is no way to render intelligible why the will would act either for the law or against the law. So there's a kind of problem of arbitrariness or randomness. And then, of course, to finish the timeline, you get Kant saying in 1797, and freedom of choice cannot be defined as some have tried to define it in terms of an ability to choose for or against the moral law. So the question for us then is, how do we make sense of the complexity of this situation? And I want to propose that we have two very general options available to us. We can try to consistently defend an interpretation of Kant as being committed to moral libertarianism, or a theory of freedom that's defined in terms of a leeway power to act for or against the moral law. That's one option. And then there's the other option, which I'm attempting to pursue in this paper, which is to try to defend a reading of Kant as being consistently committed to moral necessitarianism. And basically, I'll be completely honest with you. Whichever option you take, there's going to be serious problems. Like, there's no simple solution. This is maybe with every interpretive problem with Kant, that there's no quick, easy solution to this situation. And I'll just quickly sketch out the problems, and then we can hear what Paul has to say, and then I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Because you could say something like this: if we try to defend a reading of Kant as consistently committed to moral libertarianism, then we have to face the objection from chance that was articulated by Kreutzer and others at the time. The systematic or conceptual worry becomes, if freedom is a leeway power, an indifferent power to choose for or against the law, the worry is that now the grounds of the will become intelligible. There's no reason to explain, to illuminate, to elucidate why the will does one thing or another. It seems to be a matter of luck or randomness or arbitrariness. So that's a kind of a systematic issue. So, which is to say, anybody on an interpretive level who wants to say Kant is committed to leeway freedom has the specter of the objection from chance to contend with, and needs to come up with an answer to that. On the other hand, if you want to pursue the reading that I'm attempting to pursue in this paper, which is to say that Kant was a moral necessitarian, that he was consistently committed to the idea that the moral law is the necessary causal law of a free will, then we have the problem from necessity to contend with. And very briefly, I want to suggest that there's perhaps a simple and elegant solution to the problem from necessity that people like Ulrich were blind to. And it turns on a distinction between practical and natural necessitation. And the short version is something like this. People like Ulrich, I want to suggest, were ultimately begging the question against the possibility of there being a kind of autonomous causality, a kind of causality of the will that is from itself and not a matter of external determination. So notice that the problem, the objection from necessity, is only a problem if we're only equipped to articulate a conception of causality that is essentially mechanistic or of the variety in which the will is being determined rather than self-determining. So I want to suggest that there's room to sidestep the objection from necessity and to uphold a reading of Kant as a moral necessitarian, if we effectively distinguish between heteronymous from autonomous causality. And if we can clear that space for thinking about a kind of causality that is self-determined, then the objection sort of loses its force, or so I want to suggest. How's my time doing?
So you talked for about 11 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I maybe say one more thing?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So in the spirit of being completely open with all of the problems facing my interpretation, the big problem is how to explain for the possibility of moral evil, or the actuality of moral evil. And within the confines of this paper, I couldn't give you a fully developed theory, but I wanted to say something like this, and I'm very curious in the discussion to hear from you whether you think this is plausible. But I want to say something like, Kant is in a position to explain evil as a kind of culpable self-disempowerment. And by that I mean, evil cannot be the result of adopting a principle whose incentive is to violate the moral law. That would be what Kant calls diabolical evil, and he's very clear that that's not a possibility. So the question is, how can we be understood to be free in those moments in which we violate the moral law? Rather than say there must be some operative principle behind the activity of an evil will, I think that's problematic. We can say that the mystery of evil is something like a free misuse of freedom. And it is a kind of disempowerment insofar as it is acting away from the principle of one's own faculty of freedom, which is the moral law. And I think it's important, and you can tell me whether this works, but I think it's important throughout the religion when Kant ultimately says that evil is a mystery, which is to say that there is no insight we're ever going to have into the inner mechanism of evil. But the fact that evil has occurred implies that it is possible. And that all Kant is obliged to say is something to the effect that evil is possible because we are responsible for its occurrence. But in terms of understanding its inner dynamics, I think this is where Kant is going to invoke a kind of unknowability thesis or a claim regarding the mystery of evil. So I just flag that as a potential problem facing either Kant's moral necessitarianism or any reading of Kant's moral necessitarianism. We clearly need an answer to the problem of moral evil. Okay, I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much. This is very stimulating. And Paul Geyer has now then about 10 minutes to respond to it. Please, Paul Geyer, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Sound okay?
Yes, yeah. It's okay. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. the audience has not had a chance to read my comments yet, so I'm going to read them, and I apologize in advance. It's going to be it'd probably be more like 15 minutes. But just to summarize at the outset, I think Owen just gave the game away with the last thing he said when he referred to a free misuse of evil. Anyway, the title of my comments is "Ought implies can, not does." And the two key points that I want to make are essentially that Kant has no business attributing causal laws of any kind to the noumenal in the first place. And that, in fact, as I think that the last part of Owen's comment suggested, Kant's insistence upon the inscrutability of why Villecourt chooses one way or the other in the religion actually firmly commits him to Kreutzer's horn of the dilemma. And although I won't really have any time to go into this, I think there's a way of interpreting his remarks about definition in the introduction to the Metaphysics of Morals that is consistent with all of that. In any case, let me read my comments. So Owen's paper is a bold attempt to straighten out the crooked timber of Kant's thought about freedom of the will from the first critique through the introduction to the Metaphysics of Morals. A standard reading of Kant's trajectory would go something like this. First, in the first critique, Kant made room for freedom of the will by confining his commitment to determinism to the phenomenal world, and thus at least leaving room for non-determinist freedom of choice at the noumenal level of our wills. But secondly, 4 years later in the groundwork, he seems to have committed himself to the idea that the moral law is the causal law of the noumenal will, in spite of, as I will suggest, some passages that suggest otherwise. Thirdly, however, he seems to have recoiled from this commitment after 1788, when Ulrich pointed out that it left no room for free and therefore imputable but immoral choice, by distinguishing in the 1792 article that would become the first part of the religion between Villa as the source of moral law, but not a faculty of choice at all, and therefore neither free nor unfree, and Villecourt, the faculty of choice, which is free to choose between the two fundamental maxims of subordinating self-love to the moral law on the one hand, or subordinating the moral law to self-love on the other. A solution that also seems to have been advocated by Reinhold in 1792, although in slightly different terminology. But then in 1797, to Reinhold's complete astonishment, as expressed in his review of the first part of the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant seems to have backed away from that solution with his remark that freedom cannot be defined as the ability to choose between morality and immorality. Owen's thesis is that Kant's commitment in the groundwork to moral necessitarianism, that is the view that the moral law is the causal law of the noumenal will, was wholehearted, and that he never subsequently wavered from it, not even in the religion, where he allowed that we could, as Owen puts it, misuse and corrupt the moral law, but never freely will evil. And further, Ware defends what he takes to be Kant's position that the free will is fully determined by the moral law as an adequate and indeed perfect expression of freedom. I'm afraid that I'm convinced neither by Owen's defense of Kant's argument for moral necessitarianism in the groundwork, nor by his interpretation of the religion, and that if I were myself to argue that Kant's trajectory was not so full of hairpin turns as it seems to be, that would be only because his commitment to moral necessitarianism in the groundwork was not wholehearted in the first place. I'll say something about the groundwork first and then something about the religion. First, Owen's interpretation of what he takes to be Kant's key argument about the groundwork and his account of Kant's convincing response to Ulrich's objection is that, one, the free noumenal will must be determined by a causal law, but two, that law cannot be any ordinary natural law determining that will by inclinations or desires, for that would be heteronymous necessitation, and the moral will must be autonomous, So 3, the only alternative is that the noumenal will is determined by the moral law as the only possible expression of an autonomous rather than heteronymous will. Now, I hardly mean to deny that Kant suggests that the free will, or asserts that the free will needs a causal law, and that this must be the moral law at the outset of section 3 of the groundwork. Rather, what I want to argue is that he shouldn't have done it. Apart from the fact that Kant warns us in the first critique against apagogic proofs in transcendental philosophy, that is, arguments by elimination, his argument is doomed from the outset, because it applies a conception of causality fit for the phenomenal world, where analogizes to the causal laws of theoretical cognition, to the noumenal world, about which we are supposed to know so little, but about which we are supposed specifically to know that it is not spatio-temporal, and therefore that our ordinary conception of causality cannot apply there. While we are supposed to have enough conception of morality to know that the moral will cannot be determined heteronymously, we are not supposed to know enough about the noumenal to know that it is necessarily determined autonomously, that is, by the moral law. On the contrary, we are only supposed to know about things in themselves, that they exist as grounds of appearances, and that they are not spatial and temporal. And other than that, we can rationally believe of them only what morality requires us to believe of them. And all that morality requires us to believe about our wills as they are in themselves is that because ought implies can, we must be able to act in accordance with it. But ought implies can does not imply does. And this is presumably why Kant dropped his attempt at a metaphysical argument that the moral law is the law of the noumenal will in the second critique, never to revive it on my account. Indeed, Kant's initial suggestion in Groundwork 3, as from 446 through 452, basically, that the moral law is the causal law of the noumenally free will, was already belied by the conclusion of the section, that is from 453 on. Kant's strategic situation in Groundwork 3 is complicated. His stated objective, of course, is to show that the moral law, as analyzed in the first 2 sections of the work, on the basis of a general concept of rational agency, but in the form of the 3 formulations of the categorical imperative suitable for human beings, actually does apply to and bind us human beings, which would be a synthetic proposition. His strategy is then, as I see it, to avoid having to find a way to argue directly for what is supposed to be a fundamental ought statement from something that would have to be an even more fundamental ought, by showing that, as we are in ourselves, as opposed to how we appear to ourselves, we are spontaneous and rational beings, and so are in fact determined by the moral law as the only possible expression of pure practical reason. That's the central argument of 451-2. The question of whether we ought to be governed by the moral law would in fact thereby be rendered moot, and the argument would indeed give rise to moral necessitarianism, for our rational noumenal self would be governed by the moral law as well as being the complete ground of our phenomenal self. But no sooner has Kant stated this position than he shies away from it. He says, quote, "So categorical imperatives are possible by this, that the idea of freedom makes me a member of an intelligible world, and consequently, if I were only this, all my actions would be in conformity with the autonomy of the will. But since at the same time I intuit myself as a member of the world of sense, they only ought to be in conformity with it. To my will affected by sensible desires, there's added the idea of the same will but belonging to the world of the understanding," unquote. In other words, rather than standing by the thought that contrary to appearances, our will is always fully determined by the moral law, Kant concedes to our experience that our will is sometimes caught in a struggle between the moral law and sensible desire. But if we accept the possibility of such a struggle in the phenomenal world, and if we accept Kant's premise that the phenomenal world is grounded in the noumenal world, then we have no basis on which to deny that the ground of the possibility of this struggle must in fact lie in the noumenal will, so that there cannot be moral necessitarianism there. Further, this conclusion is consistent with Kant's strategy in the second critique, for there he gives up on the metaphysical argument that the moral law is the causal law of the noumenal will, instead derives our freedom to act in accordance with the moral law from ought implies can, and once again, ought implies can does not imply does. Further, Kant's illustration of this point by the example of the man who knows that he can resist the threats of his prince if he does not bear false witness, also says that such a man cannot know that he will, which would be sort of odd if we knew that the moral law is the causal law of the free will. Now, if all of this is correct, then the argument of the religion is continuous with that of the groundwork after all, but not in the way that Owen proposes. His view is that the religion does not presuppose or argue for what he calls leeway freedom, that is, the conception of freedom as consisting in the ability to choose between two exclusive alternatives, regardless of prior history, thus that it maintains the position that our will is free and necessarily determined by the moral law, but that the moral law can be misused and the will thus corrupted. Although he doesn't explain what could cause the will to become corrupt and misuse the moral law if the moral law were indeed the causal law of the noumenal will. In my interpretation of the religion, its entire argument is predicated on the assumption that we are always free to choose between good and evil. Moreover, that even if we have already chosen evil, we're still free to choose good, precisely because we are always free at the noumenal level to choose one way or the other. I believe that the evidence for my interpretation of the religion is ample, but in view of time, I'll cite only two passages. First, in the opening pages of part 1, Kant says that the ground of evil cannot lie any more than the ground of good, quote, in an object determining the power of choice through inclination, not in any natural impulses, but only in a rule that the power of choice itself produces for the exercise of its freedom, that is, in a maxim. And he then continues, quote, whenever we therefore say the human being is by nature good, or he is by nature evil, unquote, continuing the quote rather, this only means that he holds within himself a first ground to us inscrutable for the adoption of good or evil maxims, unquote. I've emphasized that Kant says that humans are presented with a choice between good and evil, but also that the ground for which anyone or everyone chooses one way or the other is inscrutable, which means precisely that we cannot assume that the moral law is the causal law of the nominally free will, which, as I say, or claim, Kant had in fact conceded already by the end of section 3 of the groundwork. The second passage that I would cite here comes at the heart of part 1 of the religion. Here Kant states that the fundamental moral choice facing human beings is whether to subordinate self-love to the moral law when they conflict, or whether to subordinate morality to self-love. Evil consists in subordinating morality to self-love rather than vice versa. He then says, quote, now if a propensity to this inversion does lie in human nature, then there is in the human being a natural propensity to evil, and this propensity itself is morally evil, since it must ultimately be sought in a free power of choice and hence is imputable. Yet it must be equally possible to overcome this evil, for it is found in the human being as acting freely, unquote. The point of the religion is not to argue that we are evil, for that's obvious, but it is to argue that precisely because we have freely chosen evil, we remain free to reject it and become good. I don't know how to understand this except by supposing that Kant thinks that in some inscrutable way, we are always free to choose between good and evil. So the moral law can't be the causal law of the noumenal will. In all of this, meaning will cur, the faculty of choice. One further point. Owen buttresses his interpretation of the religion by saying that Kant did not, quote, think that finite rational beings can have an incentive to do evil for the sake of evil, unquote. Kant does indeed reject the possibility of a diabolical will, in which the voice of the moral law is completely silenced and evil is chosen for the sheer sake of evil. Because he thinks it's impossible for us to completely extirpate our morally legislative reason. And indeed, he has to think this insofar as that he thinks that our cognition of the moral law is a priori. But this does not mean that we have no incentive for evil and therefore cannot actually choose evil. We have a perfectly obvious incentive for evil, namely self-love. Even if there's no such thing as a completely diabolical evil, human will, completely deaf to the moral law, there is such a thing, indeed all too common, as normally evil human will, namely that which chooses to prioritize the perfectly natural incentive of self-love over the inextirpable but not necessarily determining incentive of the moral law. It seems to me that the whole message of the religion is that this inversion of incentives is the product of free choice, but then again, so would its reversal be. Freedom is the freedom to choose between good and evil in the religion, as it had become, at least by the end of the groundwork, and is as at least consistent with what implies Karen at the second critique. Finally, it seems to me that Kant does not actually take this back in his remark in the introduction to the Metaphysics of Morals, that freedom cannot be defined as the ability to choose between good and evil. All he means by this, as I've argued elsewhere, is that this cannot be a real definition of freedom, because a real definition has to include the ratio cognoscendi of its definiendum, and it is only through our consciousness of our obligation to the moral law that we know that we are free. But free to what? Free to choose between good and evil. Okay, so thank you for your attention. I apologize for being a little long.
No reason to apologize. Thank you so much for this very rich response. And now we have lots of materials for the discussion. And so Owen Ware has now then 5 minutes to react to it, and then we open the floor for the general discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I don't know if I'll use the 5 minutes, but I'll offer some further perspectives and suggestions, and then we can get together as a group and talk about things. So I would love to talk more about, Paul, your very last point about what Kant has to say in the Metaphysics of Morals, where he denies that freedom of choice can be defined as a power to choose for or against the moral law. And your suggestion is that what he's denying is that this kind of leeway power could constitute a real definition of freedom. So I find this interesting. I'd like to talk more about that. And you then mentioned how that it's through the moral law and unconditional bindingness of the moral law, Kant's doctrine of the fact of reason in the second critique, that we get sort of a new argument for our claim to being positively free. I thought that's something we could talk about too, because it could be, and so I'm willing to grant for the sake of discussion that that's sort of like his new and improved argument that replaces the moral necessitarianism of groundwork 3. I take it that that's what you were saying, right? That the second critique, it's now via consciousness of the moral law and its unconditional bindingness that we have grounds to attribute freedom to ourselves. And we can establish that argument entirely independently of claims about noumenal causality that maybe Kant recognized were illegitimate in groundwork 3.
Right. I mean, if it's freedom to choose either way that we come to recognize through our consciousness of the obligation under the moral law, we, on Kant's view at least, have had to make room for that possibility by transcendental idealism, as he, as in the third antinomy and so on. But he's not further appealing to transcendental idealism at that point.
Yeah. I mean, I'm wondering what you would think about something like this, which is there could be maybe a way of reading the doctrine of the fact of reason that gets us to the same conclusion of the argument for moral necessitarianism in Groundwork 3, which is to say, the argument of Groundwork 3, at least initially, gets us to this claim that the moral law is the necessary causal law of a free will. And then when you look at the second critique, and I'm sure others here have views on this, but I'm not entirely sure whether what's disclosed to me through the moral law is a leeway power. I mean, I do mention this later on in my paper. I kind of take you to task for suggesting that that what's disclosed, the freedom that's disclosed to us through the moral law is an ability to choose for or against the moral law. I mean, I just don't find that reading in the second critique. It seems as though it's a very robust sense of positive freedom, transcendental autonomy that is disclosed to us through the moral law, which I think is consistent with his moral necessitarianism of the groundwork. The way I put it in the paper is something like, when you are aware of the unconditional bindingness of the moral law, you are conscious of your freedom in the transcendental sense to be a self-legislator. I don't see within the content of that obligation any implication of a leeway power to choose for or against the moral law. It's not as though the moral law places a demand on you and then says, you absolutely categorically must do X, but you're also free not to do X. So it seems like the kind of freedom that's disclosed through the factum divin vernunft is a kind of positive, autonomous freedom that seems to be consistent with the type of freedom that emerges at the end of his argument in Groundwork 3. That's just one thought that came up in my mind while you were speaking.
Can I take a second to respond? Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the second critique is the passage is very difficult to interpret. It's unbelievably brief. And I sort of waver, actually, whether I should really, how heavily I should lean on the interpretation of the second critique. I mean, I don't think there's any question what Kant's position is by the time he gets to religion. The reason the second critique is difficult, I mean, I think actually Kant himself is unclear here. He's kind of wavering possibly between two positions, as he was in Groundwork 3, at least the way I read it. So first he says, that this is all at page 30. Our consciousness of the moral law discloses to us that we have a free will, a pure will, rather. I'm sorry, he says. And that could certainly be interpreted by itself along your lines. Then, however, he says, now let's illustrate this by an example. And he gives us the example of the guy who, knows that he could control his lust if he were threatened with the gallows on exiting the house of ill repute, but isn't sure what he would do if threatened with death for refusing to bear false witness. Well, I take, and ought implies can occurs only there. Now, just as a matter of pure logic, ought implies can does not imply does. So if the argument really rests on ought implies can, it leaves the room open for leeway freedom. If it rests on something else, maybe it doesn't. By the time Kant gets to the religion, of course, he invokes ought implies can no fewer than 7 times, according to my count. And the only argument for freedom that he seems to be giving there is an ought implies can argument. The only other thing I want to add here is when you referred to conceiving of ourselves as self-legislators. I've got no beef with that, if that means, giving ourselves the moral law as a normative law, but that we are able through pure will to give ourselves the moral law as a normative law does not in and of itself entail that it's a causal law that we're actually always going to follow. So, anyway.
Yeah, no, this can I now reply to the reply, or should we just open things up?
I think we should perhaps open things for
okay.
discussion. But if you want, you can talk briefly.
How 30 seconds,
Yeah,
which
go
is
ahead. Yeah, sure.
yeah, like I'm finding this extremely helpful. Because a question, for Paul and for everybody here is sort of like, I was making lots of notes, and at the end of your reply, Paul, you said things to the effect that, according to Kant, it is inscrutable, this freedom we have to choose for or against the moral law. We both agree that he's committed to the inscrutability of this choice. And I suppose my question is something like, to what extent is it even fitting to use the label of leeway freedom here? Like when you think of the traditional notion of leeway freedom or liberty of indifference, is that consistent with the inscrutability and incomprehensibility that Kant is very clear in describing the situation of evil and immoral action? And this just might be a terminological question, but I think it bears significance just on getting clear on how we're trying to classify Kant's position on freedom. That's it. That's sort of an open question.
Great. Thank you so much. So so now the floor is open, and please use the raise hand functions on Zoom. And if it's not working, just type on the chat question, and I will also give you the word. So we have already a question, Abraham Anderson. We cannot hear you. No, for some reason we cannot hear you. No. Maybe you can type on the chat, or maybe make some tests on the computer, and if it works, then we can go back to you in a minute. Is it okay? Yeah, okay. So Nicholas Dum.
Anyway, thanks for the So I just have a question, and in a way it's not a fair question in the sense that the scope of your paper is somewhat limited to the critical stuff, and particularly Kant's moral account of freedom. You mentioned a little bit the pre-critical stuff we talked about in the past, and in the framing you have like the groundwork, like you have these three stages in terms of the development of Kant's theory of freedom, and I'm wondering, to the extent that it's more complicated, insofar as in 1755 you have something kind of necessitarian, a kind of Leibnizian compatibilist account that involves an unrestricted principle of sufficient reason. As many have argued, in the late 1760s, a switch to either something libertarian or at least kind of incompatibilist, that you get the resolution in the third antinomy. And notably also just the objection from that Kant is responding to from someone like Crusius related to things like luck or chance. And so I'm wondering maybe just how you see this particular development that you're talking about bearing on earlier developments that kind of involve a dialectic between necessitarianism and luck.
Yeah, I mean, this is the question I wanted to ask you, actually. I think you're the expert when it comes to Kant's pre-critical theories of freedom. So I mean, and this is a work in progress, my readings of what's happening prior to the first critique. I think I may have included a long footnote where I kind of am touching on this issue, but the reading that I'm inclined to adopt is something like, there is of course a shift from a form of compatibilism to a form of incompatibilism, and I take that to be relatively uncontroversial. I don't think that shift is marked by Kant's endorsement of a libertarian conception of freedom, if we define that as a commitment to a leeway power. So in a weird way, I think there is more continuity between the Kant of 1755, where there's clearly a kind of necessitarianism going on, and the critical Kant. And I think for him, the turning point was to think of causality in both natural and autonomous ways. And so this is just kind of a proposal that there might be a way to read Kant's theory of freedom from the pre-critical period to the critical period as having sort of continuous elements of necessitarianism, and that the turning point comes with his notion of autonomy. It doesn't come with his notion of a leeway libertarian power. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see lots of hands, so I won't.
Okay, we'll have to talk about this more, because if people haven't read Nick's paper on this, they should. The problem of chance that Kant was grappling with in the pre-critical period, it's extremely illuminating. So I recommend that paper.
Okay, so Ryan Wines.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So thanks very much for the paper. I'm really sympathetic to this investigation of causality in Kant's ethics. I think it's really, really interesting. And so what I was wondering, so people, when I talk to people about this, they're always very skeptical about the notion of causality in ethics. And there's often this tendency to think in terms of natural and efficient causality and to collapse it into that. And you called that a kind of form of dogmatism in your paper. And I think that's true. I think that's one of the most fascinating parts about Kant's ethical view, is that he introduces up this whole new realm of nature, a supersensible nature governed by the moral law as a causal law. So that's fascinating. And I'm wondering, well, a suggestion perhaps would be, in order to make this more plausible, is to really dig into how does this causal relation look? Like, what are the relata and what is the relation? So what is the ground? What is the consequent? What is the cause? What is the effect? And what is this relation? And how are we supposed to conceive of this? And if we can do that, then we can either lend some plausibility to the view or show that it's crazy.
Yeah, a really easy question. Thanks. So, I mean, I guess I have two thoughts, and the second is also an opportunity to pass the mic, as it were, over to Paul, because I liked the things that Paul brought up in his reply, precisely about Kant's own perhaps changing views about causality in the moral domain. The first suggestion is, if we're to just accept these terms of the ground consequent relationship, clearly it has to be a kind of an internal one, that the will is both kind of a ground and consequent to itself, and that's why its causality is not heteronymous. That's why it's an absolute causal spontaneity von selbst, from itself. And I would be happy to brainstorm like ways in which we could make that more precise, because I think that is the key way in which we can have causality in the moral domain without it reducing to heteronymous causality or natural causality or any kind of external determination. And just a footnote to that comment is that clearly for Kant, he spills a lot of ink trying to protect freedom of will from natural mechanism. But then there's also this problem of sort of theological determination or divine determination. And I think that's a whole other conversation we could have. To what extent can we be free if we are created? And that's not just natural mechanistic causality, but it introduces another potential kind of thorn in the set of puzzles that we have here. And then the second thought, which is like maybe where Paul can jump in if he wants to, is did Kant sort of have this love-hate relationship to the concept of causality when he was developing a theory of freedom during his mature theory? And did he sort of adopt a causal argument and the groundwork, which he subsequently was in the process of abandoning in the second critique, and then maybe clearly abandoned by the time of the religion? And I wanted to propose something like, in this paper, I just run with this idea that it's moral necessitarianism from the first critique all the way to the very end. But I could propose a kind of more modest interpretation, which picks up on Paul's suggestion that what Kant is doing, especially in the second critique, is analogizing on the basis of phenomenal causality to the activity of the will, which is of course not a form of causality, or he's not entitled to speak of causality at the noumenal level. So all he can do is analogize on the basis of phenomenal causality, some kind of activity pertaining to the will at the noumenal level. And I think that could be consistent with my reading, because what we can comprehend about causal relations is, of course, drawn from the phenomenal world, but can we analogize and extend those categories to the noumenal? And what grounds can we have to be warranted in doing such an extension? I think Kant's answer in the second critique is via our consciousness of the moral law. That sort of is like the normative impact of being conscious of the unconditional bindingness of morality. It gives a new sort of moral practical content to a category that is normally only valid in application to the phenomenal world. And there's that interesting section in the second critique where Kant makes a point of saying why this is a legitimate move to extend the concept of causality to the supersensible domain. Maybe it is just an analogizing of causality, but its warrant comes through our consciousness of the moral law. So I think that's still potentially consistent with the moral necessitarianism that I'm trying to defend here.
So if I can add a couple of things then.
Oh, yeah, go for it, yeah.
Having been invited. One thing is, I think that just as Kant warns us against apagogic arguments in transcendental philosophy, arguments by elimination, he's kind of cautious about arguments from analogy. That is, he thinks we make them, to be sure, but they may lead to principles of reflective rather than constitutive judgment. He talks about arguments by analogy at the end of the Doctrine and Method of the Critique of Teleological Judgment, and that's kind of where they belong. I do think that more generally, the question of how to talk about the noumenal is very complicated, right? So, of course, there's a traditional issue about whether it makes sense to talk about noumenal causality at all. Kant let himself in for a problem there which he needn't have. If only he had put as the unschematized category on the original table of categories ground and consequence, and then treated cause and effect as strictly as a schematized category, he would have avoided some problem. Namely, he would still be allowed to talk about things in themselves as grounds, but not as spatiotemporal causes. Okay, fine, that's an easy solution. The trickier part is this. Kant does think, let's correct his terminology and say that he does think that it is perfectly reasonable for us to talk about things in themselves as the grounds of appearances. Why does he think this when other people thought the concept of thing in itself was so problematic? Because he thinks that what he has done is stripped things as they exist independently of our representations of them, of spatiality and temporality, just as previous philosophers had stripped them of color and smell, although on different grounds. But he doesn't think he's ever introduced any reason to deny the existence of things in themselves. That's why he was so totally unimpressed with early objections to the concept of thing in itself, and only sort of grudgingly added a refutation of idealism to the second edition of the Critique. But even though we might say, okay, fine, he's still entitled to go on talking about things in themselves as grounds of appearances, it's, at least to me, much less clear that he has himself any ground to attribute causal laws of any kind to those things in themselves once he's placed them into this penumbra of ignorance that he has. So, okay, go on talking about them as grounds of appearances, but that there are grounding relations, so to speak, within the conduct of things in themselves, that's something, at least in my view, he's much less entitled to assume. So that's sort of a thought.
Great.
But again, I'll just add this one thing.
Okay.
I mean, for all the denials that space and time, that things in themselves are really spatial, temporal, and so on, of course we have no other way of talking about them, just because time especially is the form of all of our representations, right? So we do, let's say in the religion, talk about change of heart, and that's something that is supposed to be happen at the noumenal level. And change, of course, we think of in the first instance as a temporal concept. First you're in one state, and then you're in another state. Well, of course, we have no. We're not allowed to say that there is literally temporal change in the noumenal will. That violates the rules of the game. Of course, then again, we have no ground to say that they're unchanging. That would also be a temporal determination. That would violate the rules of the game. So all we can say is that, well, something goes on there in ways that we cannot literally represent that grounds the change of heart at the phenomenal level. We're allowed to say that, but it seems to me we're not allowed by the rules of his own game to attribute something directly analogous to causal laws to things in themselves.
Okay, thanks. So Abraham Anderson posted his question on the chat. We can quickly try to see if it works. If it doesn't, so I'll read the question. Abraham, can you try to talk again? No, I think it doesn't work. So I will read the question. So he says, this whole difficulty arises from the question going back to Socrates of whether morality is rational. In relation to that, I have a question that might help us with Kant. And here's the question, is fanaticism a theoretical or a practical error? And if the former, is it blameworthy?
Yeah, I mean, I have a quick thought on this issue, which is that I think we can agree we do not want to turn Kant's theory of freedom into a kind of Socratism in which immoral behavior just becomes behavior that stemmed from pure ignorance. I think we can all agree that Kant has to give us a story, however limited by his commitment to the inscrutability of the will. He still has to give us some story about evil as a real possibility that we are responsible for. So the second part of the question about fanaticism, if I'm understanding what you mean by fanaticism, I would say that there could be both theoretical and practical forms of fanaticism for Kant, but I think the dangerous form that takes that manifests as self-conceit or evil would absolutely be a practical error that we are responsible for. And as Paul and I agree, at the end of the day, he's going to invoke the inscrutability of this phenomenon. The question is just, what else can he say about this free, blameworthy act of evil? Yeah, those are my thoughts.
Okay, thanks. Michael.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was wondering, in your abstract, you've used the concept of immoral action, But if the moral force of an action mainly lies in the type of maxim that incentivized or that influenced the will, should we then not rather say that immorality should only be linked to a person's will rather than to actions?
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes. Do you find that problematic, or was there a sort of...
No. I find problematic that you use the concept of immoral action.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I should be more precise. I should be more precise, because it's not, the emphasis is not on the deed or the external action, but on the willing. It may just be a bad habit, I think, of Kant scholars to assume that the two are synonymous. But yeah, no, I meant the disposition and the willing and the adoption of a maxim. And that's sort of what I label as action, but it's not in the narrow sense of the external deed. Yeah, thanks for that.
Right, but you don't want to separate the external action completely from the maxim either,
right?
Because the maxim is an action, is a maxim to perform certain kinds of actions in certain kinds of situations, and that we evaluate the agent by the agent's maxims, but the maxim, of course, is a maxim to perform a certain kind of action. This is just the same point that every other philosopher of the time made, simply by talking about, of course, the focus of moral valuation is the intended action, or the action as intended, rather than the what might have actually happened, which always involves, or which may always involve, factors beyond the agent's control.
Yeah.
Okay, Julius.
Hello, is the sound okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, first of all, so much for the paper. I am at the moment pursuing a very similar take on Kant and trying to grapple with these very same problems. And I found the paper very useful, very helpful. So thank you for that. And I'll try to sort of give my take on this, on what I perceive to be the crux of the problem, which is this can but doesn't moment, which Paul raised. And I've been thinking of this in terms of a metaphor, in which the person or a human being who has the capacity to act freely is in a river, and he is being carried by the water, and this carrying by the water is his heteronomy. This is him being determined by passions, by empirical needs, and so on and so forth. His freedom would, in this metaphorical landscape, consist in him swimming, him being able to try and break out of this heteronymous flow, which is a part of him in terms of him as practical. And now the question is, if he can, and if this can is a moral necessity, if it flows from as moral necessitarianism sort of would give it, the problem is there are moments when he doesn't, and then the water takes him as some heteronymous determination, and therefore he is not then free. And then what I found to be very helpful in your paper, and this is also what I am trying to think about, is this contrast between a holy will and this situation of a human will, which is this person in this stream. And I think the reason why the person not swimming seems to raise a problem is because him not swimming, by the fact that there is this water that is carrying him, sort of changes the overall situation. So when he does not swim, when he is not acting autonomously, the situation changes, and he then is carried by the water. Yet if we conceive of this holy will, which doesn't have this heteronymous determination, i.e. it's not, I'm sorry for this very metaphorical sort of conveying of the idea, but I don't have a better one at the moment. Yet if we conceive of a holy will as a will that does not have this determination by this stream of water, then it not swimming or it swimming is sort of a non-question even. And so my idea or my contention is that the only reason why a person not swimming sort of requires an explanation is because of this overtaking by heteronym. Whereas a holy will, if we were to contrast the two, it not swimming would not change the situation because there wouldn't be a stream, so to say. And so we can kind of see a parallel which would support this idea that the person is only free to swim, and this not swimming is this Unding or Unvermögen, something like that. So yeah, that's my question. I hopefully this metaphor was clear enough.
Yeah, I like the metaphor, and it reminded me of this passage from the Metaphysics of Morals, where Kant says, "Virtue is always in progress and yet always starts from the beginning. It is always in progress because, considered objectively, it is an ideal and unattainable, while yet constant approximation to it is a duty. That it always starts from the beginning has a subjective basis in human nature, which is affected by inclinations, because of which virtue can never settle down in peace and quiet with its maxims, adopted once and for all, but if not rising, is unavoidably sinking." So that passage actually fits well with your metaphor, because you could say the problem is not just being carried downstream, but kind of sinking. I guess I have two thoughts. At one point, you used the language of overtaking, and I think we need to be careful there. Because that would mean that immorality is not something that can be imputed to you. If it's like the water or the flow of the stream just overtaking you, right? There has to be, the puzzle is like how to understand that allowing oneself to be taken by the water, that freedom to follow the inclinations. And then the second point picks up with your last comment about the Vermögen or Unvermögen. And I'm glad that someone finally brought this up, because I make this is like of enormous importance in my paper. And it struck me as significant. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I thought that it is significant that Kant says that there is no Vermögen to act against the moral law. And so that suggests that a Vermögen, or a power of choice, is always governed by the moral law. But there could still be some kind of freedom that itself is an Unvermögen, but is somehow still imputable to the agent. That is the phenomenon of immorality or evil. So I don't know if this helps you in any way, but I think I like the metaphor, and I think we're basically on the same page. I would just stress that we can't use the analogy to characterize immorality as an instance of being overtaken by something. I don't know, Paul, if you have any thoughts about the Vermögen and Unvermögen distinction, but
that's exactly what I'm trying to look at right now. It seems to me that he does say that freedom to choose evil would merely be an Unvermögen, but he doesn't say exactly, I'm not seeing it, but he doesn't say exactly that we have no ability to choose evil, that we have no Vermögen to do so. I mean, technically it's a Unvermögen, but
right.
obviously we choose evil. I mean, unless he's just completely subtracting the religion, he couldn't quite say that.
I mean, I'll say one thing quickly and then other people can jump in, but I did, when I was working on this paper, I really tried my best to find a place in which Kant speaks of a Vermögen in the context of evil, and I couldn't find it. I'm not saying it's not there, but I couldn't find it.
Well, I can't think of off the top of my head of a place where he uses that word.
Right.
But the whole argument of the religion is we have chosen evil, and therefore, of course, we can choose good. So whatever he calls it, there is the possibility of such a choice. There's some people think he's even claiming that there's an a priori argument that we have chosen that. Right. I don't think there's any such argument, but many have tried to argue that.
Okay, so we will extend the formal part for about 5 to 10 minutes so that we can listen to our remaining questions, but please be concise. So John.
Yeah, thanks very much for your talk, Owen, and for your comments, Paul. So I was hoping to press you a little on the notion that moral evil could be traced back to a kind of corruption of a one-way power of choice that's governed by the moral law as its causal law. As I read the religion, this kind of weakness and frailty is itself supposed to be grounded in a fundamental maxim that the free power of choice adopts. And so the question would be, well, what kind of freedom is at issue here? Because it seems that the fundamental maxim that's going to ground the kind of human frailty at issue here couldn't itself be governed by the moral law as its causal law. Another passage, which he doesn't elucidate it, but he mentions around page 100 in the Critique of Practical Reason of the Academy edition, that the conduct of the villain is the consequence of freely adopted principles. And so it seems that even in the Critique of Practical Reason, he's already made room for this idea that we have the power to freely choose to transgress the moral law. So I was hoping you might say a bit about that. Just to be quick with respect to Unvermögen, I follow Paul's position in spirit, if not in letter, that Kant's remarks in 226, 227 of the Metaphysics of Morals pertain to the definition of free will. He mentions the Latinate definieren, and the sentences before and after where he makes the claim about the Unvermögen, he talks about a principle of definition for distinguishing the concept of the free power of choice from the animal power of choice. And below that, he talks about a hybrid definition. So there's a decent amount of textual evidence that he's concerned with the technical point about a definition of the free power of choice, namely that it can only include reference to the moral law, since that is the ratio cognoscendi of freedom. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. I'm thinking maybe you and I can have an email correspondence just to get into the details of this, given that we're running out of time today. But yeah, I think one of the crucial issues has to do with what is the nature of Kant's commitment to the inscrutability of evil, and does that undercut any commitment to describing a Vermögen to evil in terms of a leeway power? And that's what I'm skeptical of. But so I'm not sure, we may have a complementary position here, and we're just putting emphasis on different aspects of Kant's position. But let's talk more about this.
Okay, thanks. Steve.
Hi, thank you for a very illuminating paper. I'd like to ask a historical question about the ghost of Spinoza and Spinozism, which I think is haunting the debate, which you don't mention. It's obviously there in the Pietist critique of Wolff, and seems to be key to why Crucius is affirming liberty of indifference. So I was wondering, just having not read Ulrich and Kreutzer, whether they are kind of specific, they specifically have this kind of traditional debate in mind about Spinoza's fatalism and so on. And I also wanted to ask you about some of the aspects of your reconstruction, particularly around page 10, where there seem to be Spinozist overtones, which I feel perhaps are kind of stronger in your reconstruction than perhaps in Kant, where you're talking about the will as a causal power admitting degrees of perfection, and then the most perfect degree would be the divine will, which is kind of simultaneously determined to act according to its nature and therefore free. I mean, so this is obviously echoes, it has various resonances with Spinoza, and also your definition of evil that you added at the end of your talk as culpable self-disempowerment. So I just felt that I would like to hear some, if you would like to add in your reflections on this kind of Spinozist undercurrent.
Yeah, well, this would be another moment to invite Paul to jump in, because Paul has a reading of Kant as a kind of moral perfectionist that I find very compelling. And I'm sort of bringing the spirit of that reading into Kant's theory of freedom, which again centers on this idea of a power or a Vermögen that for finite rational beings like ourselves can be infinitely perfected. And the ideal of that perfection is the holy will. But we're only ever going to approximate the perfection of that power. Later on, I mentioned how this capacity is autonomy, but its perfection and actualization and realization is what Kant calls autocracy, the actual ability to be a self-legislator. So I don't know, Paul, if this is consistent with the spirit of your perfectionist reading of Kant, but it's not meant to just be a reconstructive position. I think that there is a textual case to be made for reading this kind of perfectionism in Kant. With regards to the question of the Spinozistic background, I think I'll leave that question just to the side for now, because I think at least when Kant was formulating his theory of freedom in the first critique, I'm not sure how much he was directly thinking about problems to do with Spinozism, although it very soon became a lively controversy that he obviously had things to say about. But in terms of understanding the foundations of Kant's own theory of freedom, I'm not sure how directly impactful it was.
I think that's right. I can't think of any reference to Spinoza in the first critique, and then it appears really only in the third critique, and how much knowledge of Spinoza Kant actually had, I wouldn't venture to say. I don't think that Varga's catalog of the library shows a copy of Spinoza in it, although we can't infer anything at all from that. On the question of perfectionism, yes, I mean, so my position is that, I mean, particularly in the Collins lectures, Kant puts his own emerging moral theory in the spot in his table of possible approaches to moral theory in the spot reserved for perfectionism, and it's something like the perfection of freedom in oneself and all that is the underlying principle. And then, of course, in the actual metaphysics of morals, the account of duty to oneself, ethical duty to oneself, is thoroughly perfectionistic, drawn heavily from Baumgarten's ethics. But that in all those cases, of course, his view, my interpretation would be that these conceptions of perfection define the moral goal, and that that's separate from any form of necessitarianism or assumption that we somehow cannot but strive for this moral goal. I mean, it could still be consistent with your moral necessitarianism that on the one, that we do not ever actually fully realize the goal, but nevertheless we necessarily strive for it. That would be a consistent position. I wouldn't myself want to adopt that position, but But interpreting Kant's conception, both in the most general level and in the more specific level of the doctrine of virtue in perfectionist terms, doesn't decide the question of moral necessitarianism one way or the other.
Okay, thanks. And Paul Guyer has kindly agreed to share his comments on the paper, and the comments are already available on the chat.
Thank you, Karen.
Yeah, thank you for sharing it. Yeah, Pavel.
How are we doing for time, Luis?
We will extend for 10 minutes, so we still have 15. We will do the 3 questions.
Why don't you take the other 2 and then come back to me if there's time?
Okay. So Robert Stern.
Thank you. Well, again, maybe I should pass in the sense that very stupidly I got all the time zones wrong because I'm not where I usually am, and I seem to have missed the first hour. But I just wanted to have a quick thought on the Unvermögen issue, because from what Owen said, it hadn't been discussed. I just wondered if you two or others would agree. I mean, the way I would read it is the Unvermögen idea has a sort of normative element to it. So we have this capacity for choice, but you shouldn't define what freedom is with that capacity in mind, because it's a kind of defective capacity. So the holy will wouldn't have this choice, and we only have it because we're not. So it would be like sort of defining a house by the fact that, you know, a bad house will let in rain through the roof, and that's not how you should define freedom. So it gives you a way of sort of squaring the circle by saying, well, the holy will, which doesn't have Willkür, counts as totally free, but we do, but that's freedom in a defective form. Is that, I'm just, yeah, I hope that's consistent with sort of what Owen and Paul might think, but I just wanted to check.
Well, I mean, for my part, I think that that's a helpful way of framing it. I'm glad that you showed up, by the way.
Yeah, I'm very sorry I came late. I'm really annoyed with myself, but anyway.
No, it's good. It's good that you made it. Yeah, I needed some support. So, I mean, because I think we have a similar, a somewhat overlapping reading here. But I'm glad that you emphasized the normative dimension of the Vermögen, because actually that's the dimension I really want to make prominent in Kant's moral necessitarianism, and I feel that label is clouding it and rendering it murky, because, you know, this idea that Kant is analogizing on the natural causality of the phenomenal domain and extending that via consciousness of the moral law to the supersensible domain, I think that does get us to this idea of that the exercise of freedom as a Vermögen is thoroughly normative. And that also explains the element of perfectionism, that it's striving to actualize an ideal. And so the analogy of causality is simply subservient to the normative perfectionist ideal of exercising this Vermögen. And to give a definition of that, that's a real definition, would of course leave out anything like an ability to do otherwise or a leeway power. Anything that would imply a corruption would be left out of a real definition. So I feel, yeah, that is the key, in fact, to making sense of the moral necessitarianism. And you might then think, well, the language of necessitarianism is just then distorting and creates more confusion than clarity. And that might be the case, because, I don't want to say that the causality of the moral law that operates upon the will is like a natural causal law, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would put it as it were in terms of reasons rather than causes, to use slightly anachronistic language. So I mean, you're following the moral law from a rational perspective, so it's not causal in the more phenomenal sense, but there's no room for choice because reason settles what you must, you know, what is to be done. At least.
Can I just add two?
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, carry on.
Two super quick thoughts here. One, I mean, substantively, I like your suggestion. I'm not 100% sure that philologically it would fly, that Kant ever uses Vermögen in a strictly normative sense, or that anyone else does. But the other thing that just occurred to me, I should go back and add this as a footnote to my paper in the Watkins volume, is, of course, Kant famously says, at least at one stage in his career, that definitions should come at the end in philosophy, not at the beginning. And that suggests, perhaps we have clearly a clear proof in the religion that we are free to, or a clear position in the religion that we are free to choose between good and evil. And, we ought ultimately to make our definitions match that rather than trying to block that by appeal to a definition. Just a thought.
Yeah, thanks. Almira.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for this intriguing talk and paper, Professor Ware, and many thanks to the Leuven team to organize the presentation tonight. And thank you, Professor Geyer, for your fantastic response. Before my question, I want to deliver a message personally to Professor Geyer from Professor Lucas Torp, who is your former PhD student from the University of Pennsylvania and who happens to be our professor on Kant, from whom I and Begum here are currently taking a Kant course at Boğaziçi University, Istanbul. The class was today, and he said hi to you and told us that he
Thank you very much.
participate to this fruitful discussion if he hadn't had the course to teach. So I want to deliver the message regarding your paper, Professor Ware. I'm wondering if a discussion on happiness is irrelevant or relevant. A discussion in your paper, you make a discussion specifically on the contrast between moral necessitarianism as anti-indifferentialism, on the concept of lawless will, and libertarian will's activity. So wouldn't be a discussion on Kant's rejection in the religion and in the groundwork of both eudaimonism and Stoicism on the relationship between happiness and morality relevant? And as Professor Geyer pointed out, doesn't the can and doesn't moment in the groundwork and religion also relate us to the to Kant's rejection of Stoicism, which holds that happiness has no place in the realm of morality at all? So Kant needs to find a third way between eudaimonism and Stoicism, and he writes very plentifully in the religion and in the groundwork. So I'm wondering why you thought it to be irrelevant in your paper about the discussion on the relationship between happiness and morality. Thank you so much.
Thanks for that. I think I bracketed that topic just for the sake of trying to clarify Kant's theory of freedom, not because I think it's disconnected with what he says about happiness. So it was kind of just a strategic move to postpone or to shelve certain issues to do with happiness. But I think there are various ways in which it does come into the conversation. And one of them would be what Kant has to say about the moral agent being the agent who makes a commitment to morality primary and subordinates a commitment to their own happiness to their moral commitments, which is to say, the moral agent pursues happiness only if it's consistent with duty, not the other way around. And so clearly happiness is playing some constitutive role in Kant's ethics, and I am not wanting to deny that. But I guess I'm suggesting it can be bracketed just for the sake of trying to get clear on, well, what is the nature of that moral will that has a commitment to duty? How are we to understand that? How are we to understand the freedom that goes behind the constitution of a moral will? I don't know if that helps, but I'm basically just saying, yes, I think the conversation about happiness is absolutely crucial and relevant, but I was just kind of like focusing on freedom.
Okay, so Pavel.
Okay, thanks very much for the paper and the discussion. So I want to relate some of these Unvermogen issues back to the original problem that was motivating your paper. That's I guess for the Nestorian reading, that's the Reinhold objection. So Reinhold seems to be worried that only moral actions are free, immoral actions are not free because they're heteronomously determined, and hence it's impossible to impute immoral actions to an agent qua free. And I think I take your response to that is when you read the possibility of immoral actions as not expressing a genuine ability, as a deterioration of a genuine capacity. So I guess I don't see how that solves the problem, because if precisely our capacity to will freely is deteriorated, then we're determined not freely but heteronomously, and then immoral action would still seem to be heteronomously determined and hence unfree, and hence not imputable to us qua free agents. So I guess I mean, maybe I missed something in your paper, but I guess I don't see how that responds to the original Reinholdian or Ulrichian worry. And I guess maybe for Paul Geyer's account, I guess the relevant problem is the Kreutzer problem of what do you call it, chance. So based on your reading, what do you take Kant's response to be? Do you think he succumbs to that criticism, or is the response inscrutability, or we can't know one way or the other? Thanks.
Yeah, I wanted Paul to actually to come back to that issue as well, because Paul, you seem to suggest that Kant's theory does land on the horn of the objection from chance that Kreutzer raised. I don't know if you wanted to jump in and talk about that.
Right. I mean, that is what I suggested. I mean, I hadn't thought about it in terms of Kreutzer before, but I mean, obviously, from the time of Nova Delucidatio on, Kant was worried about the liberty of indifference. He wasn't completely happy with it, but in the end, that does seem to me to be where he ends up, because he's, at least epistemically, why we should choose one way or the other on evil versus good is inscrutable. So we're not in a position to offer any explanation. Maybe it's not a matter of chance. Maybe, who knows? We're just not in an epistemic position to say one way or the other. So I think, so to speak, for all practical purposes, he does actually end up on the Kreutzer side of the dilemma. At least that's how it seems to me.
And Pavel, just touching briefly on your first question about what happens to Reinhold's objection, I actually think this connects up with John Walsh's question, and I'll give a similar reply, which is maybe this is something we could talk about in more detail, because I think it is the crucial question of how Kant is able to be committed to the inscrutability of evil on the one hand, but still say enough about evil as something that can be imputed to an agent, so that it does amount to Morgan sort of dissolving, and hence not being something that could be accountable. That would reintroduce the Reinholdian objection. And at the end of my paper, I'm suggesting that there's ways in which we could maybe understand things in terms of culpable self-disempowerment, but I don't want that disempowerment to be sort of like an utter loss or an utter disillusion. I think there's space there to make sense of this, but for future conversations.
All right, thanks.
Okay, so thank you very much for this very fruitful discussion. And I would just like to remind you before we finish today that next week we have another talk at the Leuven seminar by Arashi Abasari on Hegel's ontology of power, the structure of social domination in capitalism. And we will have Karin Eng as a respondent to the paper. So thank you very much for your presence today. It was very fruitful, and you are all invited to remain online for the informal part of the meeting.